Fred and Rose West, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine May Wood. These are just some of history's most infamous serial killing couples. Though their vicious and brutal crimes will never be forgotten, they tend to overshadow numerous other criminal duos whose cruelty is just as severe. Join us for today's episode as we examine 3 disturbing cases of couples who were literally partners in crime. Alvin and Judith Neelley. 26-year-old Alvin Neelley met with 15-year-old Judith Ann Adams in 1980, and shortly after, he left his wife and 3 children to elope with her. Judith was described in her youth as a troubled child from a big family in Tennessee. She lost her alcoholic father when she was 9, following a motorcycle accident, and when she met Alvin in her teens, she embarked on a life of crime with him. What began as petty thefts became armed robbery, which then escalated to murder. The pair's first victim was a 13-year-old named Lisa Ann Milliken, who vanished on September 25, 1982. A resident of a children's home, Lisa had been visiting the arcade at Riverbend Mall in Rome, Georgia, with other residents when she was lured away from the group by the Neelleys and taken to a motel in Scottsboro, Alabama. The next few days were the most horrific of Lisa's short life. She was raped multiple times by both Neelleys for 3 days, until she was taken to Little River Canyon in Fort Payne, Alabama by Judith and handcuffed to a tree. Judith then injected Lisa 6 different times with bleach and drain cleaner. The injection sites were both sides of her neck, both arms, and both buttocks. Lisa suffered excruciating pain, but did not die, until Judith turned a gun on her and pulled the trigger, before pushing the 13-year-old's body into the canyon. The couple later called the authorities several times to report the body, which was found on the canyon floor. The lives of the Neelleys were far from glamorous. After the murder, they drove across the American South, sleeping in their car, constantly on the run. They stole to fund their lives and forged checks, and at the age of 16, Judith became pregnant with twins. Even far into her pregnancy, Judith continued to commit crimes, including armed robberies. A failed robbery in Georgia saw the two put in prison, where Judith gave birth. But as soon as they were out, the couple reunited and continued with their life of crime. On October 4th, 1982, the Neelleys came across a young couple named Janice Chapman and John Hancock. They lured the pair in with promises of an exciting party, but in reality, Judith took them to the woods where Alvin shot John and left him to die. Now left with Janice, they bundled her into their vehicle and drove to their motel, where she was tortured before she was killed. The Neelleys were unable to take any more victims after this because they botched the previous crime. Neither Judith nor Alvin had bothered to check if John Hancock was actually dead after he was shot. The young man survived his wounds, and not only was he able to get help, but he was able to assist in the identification of the assailants. The lead detective on the case subsequently followed the Neelleys for several weeks before arresting them in Tennessee. In order to avoid the death penalty, Alvin pleaded guilty to murder and aggravated assault in Georgia, but was not tried for the murder of Lisa Milliken, since it was Judith who pulled the trigger. He was sentenced to life in prison. Judith, meanwhile, did not plead guilty and was put on trial in March of 1983. While awaiting the start of the trial, she gave birth to the couple's 3rd child. 6 weeks after the trial began, Judith was convicted of the torture murder of Lisa Milliken and sentenced to death via the electric chair, a decision which had come from the judge as the jury had recommended life imprisonment. She was the youngest woman sentenced to death in the US at just 18 years old. Following the conviction, she decided to plead guilty to the murder of Janice Chapman. She attempted to appeal for a new trial in regards to the Lisa Milliken case, but her request was denied. In 1999, when she was just days from her execution date, her sentence was commuted to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 31 years behind bars. The governor who made this decision, Fob James, reportedly cited the fact that the jury had recommended life in prison at her trial as the reasoning behind his verdict. In 2023, Judith was denied parole. The sister of Lisa, Tina Milliken, recalled being frustrated that it was even a possibility that Judith be released to the public, stating, quote, "She killed a child. Why keep going through this? Why keep putting families through this?" Numerous Milliken family members spoke at the hearing, as did the former DA, Mike Odell, who described Judith as someone who killed for sport and added that she was evil and depraved. Judith will be up for parole again in 2028. Alvin died in prison in 2005. Alton Coleman and Debra Brown. Debra Brown was 21 when she met 28-year-old Alton Coleman in 1983. It's unclear where the two met, but by all accounts, Brown quickly fell under Coleman's spell, breaking off her engagement to be with him. Described as a non-violent, borderline intellectually disabled woman, Brown was the complete opposite of Coleman, a middle school dropout who lived with his grandmother and had been in and out of trouble with the law since the early 1970s. He had been charged with sex crimes 6 times over the last decade, with 2 of those cases being dismissed. He was acquitted on 2 of the other charges and pled guilty to a lesser crime. He was due to go on trial in Illinois following the rape of a 14-year-old, but fled the state and began a killing spree with his new girlfriend, Brown, instead. The couple's first murder occurred on May 29, 1984, after they befriended Juanita Wheat in order to get to her 9-year-old daughter, Vanita. The little girl was taken from Kenosha, Wisconsin, to the city of Waukegan, Illinois, 20 miles away, where she was raped and strangled to death. Her body was found on June 19th in an abandoned building, just 4 blocks from where Coleman had been living with his grandmother. 2 days after the death of Vanita Wheat, they befriended a man named Robert Carpenter, spent the night at his house, and asked to borrow his car to run some errands the next morning. Of course, the couple never returned, and the man was left without his vehicle. Brown and Coleman took off for Indiana, where they wound up in the city of Gary. By this time, the FBI were aware that Coleman was on the run, and were beginning their pursuit of the couple, unaware that the body of Vanita Wheat was lying abandoned in Waukegan. In Gary, on June 18th, the couple spotted 2 little girls walking near their home and snatched them from the streets. They were subsequently beaten and raped, with 9-year-old Annie Turks managing to survive as she was left abandoned after being choked into unconsciousness, while her niece, 7-year-old Tamika Turks, was strangled to death. Tamika's body was recovered the following day, partially decomposed. Later that day, 25-year-old Donna Williams vanished from Gary. Like the other victims, she was raped and strangled. Her body was discovered several weeks later on July 11th in Detroit, Michigan, just half a mile from where her vehicle was located at the time of her disappearance. On July 2nd, Coleman beat a Detroit couple in their home with a pipe. Mr. and Mrs. Palmer Jones of Dearborn Heights were severely injured, with Coleman ripping their telephone from their wall so they couldn't call for help. The couple then stole their money and fled the scene in their car. The pair then moved to Toledo, Ohio, where, 5 days later, they murdered Virginia Temple, a woman they had befriended. According to reports, Virginia, a mother of several children, had not been heard from in days when police went to check on her. Inside, they found most of the children scared but unharmed. However, upon examining the home's crawl space, authorities discovered the bodies of Virginia and her eldest daughter, 9-year-old Rachel. They had both been strangled to death and stuffed inside. That same day, Brown and Coleman entered the home of another couple, this time Frank and Dorothy Duvendak, who resided in Toledo. The Duvendaks were bound with electrical cords so that Brown and Coleman could steal their money, valuables, and vehicle. Following the murders of Virginia and Rachel Temple, the couple fled to Dayton, where they visited Reverend Millard Gay and his wife, Catherine. Coleman and Brown stayed with the Gays for a short while and accompanied them to a church service on July 9th. They were then dropped off in Cincinnati, where 3 days later, the couple picked out their next victim. 15-year-old Toni's Story went missing on July 12th from her neighborhood of Over the Rhine. 8 days later, her remains were found, reportedly with a piece of jewelry that had been stolen from the Temple residence. On July 19th, the killers cycled to Norwood, where they attacked another couple, Harry and Marlene Walters. Harry had been beaten into unconsciousness, while Marlene was raped and beaten to death. A later report by the coroner noted that Marlene's assault was vicious. She was hit around 20 to 25 times with a blunt object. The pair stole the Walters car after the assault and murder and fled the scene. Brown and Coleman subsequently went to Kentucky, where they kidnapped a university professor and stuffed him into the trunk of his car after demanding his wallet. The professor would later tell police after he was found in the boot of the abandoned vehicle that the pair had made him call his wife and tell her he had a massive gambling debt and owed a lot of money. All the cash in their savings account was to be brought to a phone booth in Richmond, but the couple didn't bother to collect the money, and it's unknown why. Brown and Coleman left the car on July 17th in Dayton and returned to the home of the Gays to steal their car. Their last victim was 75-year-old Eugene Scott, who was murdered in Indianapolis. The pair stole his vehicle before heading to Evanston, Illinois. Coleman and Brown were now wanted criminals, even making it to the FBI's 10 most wanted list, although they were technically 11th on the list. Since their faces and descriptions were plastered everywhere, it was easy enough for witnesses to identify them, and they did. The couple were arrested on July 20th in Evanston. Ultimately, they were found guilty of the rape and murder of Toni's Story, as well as Marlene Walters in the state of Ohio, and sentenced to death. Coleman reportedly responded to this with, "I'm dead already." The couple were also given 20 years each concerning the kidnapping of the professor, whom they drove across state lines. Coleman was executed by lethal injection on April 26, 2002. For some time, Brown was the last woman on Indiana's death row, but a Lake County prosecutor and the Indiana Attorney General's office withdrew the execution demand in 2018 after her lawyers appealed, citing mental health issues. Similarly, her death sentence in Ohio was commuted to life in prison in 1991 due to her low IQ scores, her lack of criminal record prior to meeting Coleman, and what is described as a master-slave dynamic she had with him, which was said to have influenced her actions. Brown will likely never see the light of day, however, as she is serving 140 years in prison in Indiana, as well as her Ohio life sentence. She is currently incarcerated at the Dayton Correctional Institution in Dayton, Ohio. Monique Olivier and Michel Fourniret. Michel Paul Fourniret, born April 4, 1942, in Sedan, France, had a criminal record long before he began committing murders with his wife. As an adult, he drifted through life, bouncing from one minimum wage job to another, seemingly aimless, and by the mid-1960s, he was running into trouble with the law. He was first arrested in 1966 after sexually assaulting a young girl, and by 1984 he was in prison, serving time after sexually abusing 5 more young women. While incarcerated, he began writing letters to a woman named Monique Olivier as part of a pen pal program. He described horrific and violent fantasies of abusing and murdering children in his letters, and Olivier responded by claiming that she'd help him fulfill these fantasies if he murdered her husband. Although he never did, the pair began a relationship anyway once Fourniret was released from prison in 1987. In early December that year, the couple found their first target, a 17-year-old schoolgirl named Isabelle Laville. On the 11th, the pair drove in separate vehicles to where they found Isabelle walking home. Olivier stopped her car and asked Isabelle if she would hop in and give her directions, to which the 17-year-old agreed. They continued driving a little until they came across Michel, who was standing by the side of the road pretending his car had broken down. Olivier offered him a lift and he climbed in the back. There, he choked Isabelle with a piece of rope while his partner sedated her using the date rape drug Rohypnol. The couple subsequently drove Isabelle to their home, where she was raped and strangled to death. Her body was thrown down a disused well, where it remained until July 11, 2006, when it was finally retrieved, 18 years after she vanished. In March of the following year, Fourniret Hamik, the wife of an incarcerated bank robber, contacted Michel. She knew him because her husband had shared a cell with him in prison, and she asked for his help in retrieving some stolen goods from a cemetery. Michel agreed. After gathering the items, Fourniret gave him a share of the goods. On April 12th, though, Michel and Monique decided they wanted the whole haul. They lured Fourniret out of her home and strangled and buried her body before going back to her house to retrieve the items. They used the money they subsequently made to purchase a chateau in Donchery in northern France. Fourniret's body has never been recovered. 5 months later, in August 1988, the couple struck again when Monique, who is now pregnant with Michel's baby, asked a 20-year-old woman to get in the car with them so they could be directed to the nearest doctors. Monique pretended to be ill, and the woman, Fabienne Leroy, agreed. However, Michel drove to a nearby forest instead, where Fabienne was raped and murdered via gunshot. In March of 1989, 21-year-old Jean-Marie Desremaux became the next victim after she met Michel on the train several times starting in January, and he and Monique invited her to their home for a meal. At their home, however, things took a turn when Michel asked Jean-Marie if she was a virgin, and she explained that she wasn't and had a boyfriend. By all accounts, this greatly angered Michel, and he began to attack her and attempted to rape her. Jean-Marie fought back and almost escaped, but the couple caught her, gagged her using bandages, and strangled her to death. They buried her body in the garden of their chateau. In December of 1989, 6 months after they tied the knot, and now with a 1-year-old child in the back seat, the couple looked for their next victim, eventually settling on a 12-year-old girl named Elizabeth Bruchette, who was walking home from a friend's house in the city of Namur, Belgium. Elizabeth was ultimately strangled to death after Michel failed to suffocate her using a plastic bag, and her body was buried in the chateau garden near Jean-Marie's. The remains of both girls would be found in 2004 after the couple confessed to the murders. The final murder at the hands of the couple occurred on November 21st, 1990, when they came across 13-year-old Natasha Dainis, who was walking home. As they always did, the couple lured her into their car and drove her to a secluded area where she was stabbed twice in the chest with a screwdriver and strangled. Her body was left on the nearby beach, and a later examination of the body by the coroner revealed that Natasha had been raped post-mortem. Between 2000 and 2001, Michel committed 2 more murders without his wife. The first was of 18-year-old Celine Saison, who was raped and strangled with rope, and the second was a 13-year-old girl named Mananya Tumpong, who he invited to play with his son. Instead of taking her home to see the boy, though, Michel drove her to a secluded area where she was strangled to death. He also attempted to kidnap a 13-year-old girl in 2003, but failed. Notably, he was investigated around this time as the possible perpetrator, but authorities could not link him to the crime. It wasn't until a year later that Monique revealed to the police that her husband had been murdering since 1987. When investigators questioned Michel, he revealed that he had killed 8 women and girls, and 1 man whose name remains unknown. Michel was subsequently extradited to France along with his wife, as the couple were living in Belgium at the time, and he was convicted of 7 murders. Following his conviction, he was given life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Monique was given life in prison, though she would be eligible for parole after serving 28 years. In recent years, Michel has confessed to 3 more murders, all of them women and girls between the ages of 9 and 20. Michel Fourniret died in 2021, aged 79. He has been dubbed Ogre of the Ardennes. Meanwhile, in 2023, Monique Olivier was tried for her part in the final 3 murders her husband confessed to, and was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. When asked about Olivier, the father of one of the victims noted, "Her presence alone would have gained the confidence of all the victims, who would never have believed a woman could have been such a part of such an appalling and depraved act." At her sentencing, Olivier said, "I regret everything I did, and I ask for forgiveness from the families of the victims, while knowing that it is unforgivable." However, the president of the court stated that Olivier, quote, "had no empathy for her victims, who she dehumanized." And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own thoughts and reactions, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.